What would you do if you discovered that the darkest pages of your city's history had been deliberately torn from the official archives? Kharkiv, 1903. The city is growing and thriving, industry is developing, and along with it, the wealth of local merchants is increasing. But behind the facades of luxurious mansions and the hum of new factories lurks something so terrible that the Tsarist secret police preferred to destroy all traces of the investigation. The Bondarenko family case, which was never meant to see the light of day. If you appreciate genuine historical investigations, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of our history. On a cold October morning in 1989, when the Soviet Union was already creaking at the seams but had not yet completely collapsed, a young historian, Alexei Nemov, was sorting through documents in the basement of the regional archive. The room was poorly lit. The lamps flickered, creating an unsettling atmosphere among the endless rows of dusty folders and boxes. The air was musty, saturated with the smell of old paper and mold. This basement housed documents that no one had requested for decades. Many of them dated back to the Tsarist period, before the 1917 revolution. Alexei was working on his dissertation on the industrial development of Kharkiv in the early 20th century and hoped to find materials on the first factories and plants. He methodically went through box after box, folder after folder, when his attention was drawn to an unusual metal box hidden behind a shelf. The box was covered in a thick layer of dust, indicating that it had not been touched for decades. On the side wall was engraved an inscription in Old Russian, KHGZHU secret store separately. Intrigued, Alexei tried to open the box, but it was locked. Normally, he would have asked the archivist for the key, but something about this find made him act differently. Perhaps it was the intuition of a historian sensing an important discovery, or maybe just plain curiosity. He looked around, made sure no one was there, and with the help of a small screwdriver, which he always carried with him to repair his glasses, he managed to open the lock. Inside, he found a folder wrapped in fabric darkened with age. When Alexei unwrapped the fabric, his nostrils were filled with a strange odor, a mixture of something chemical and metallic. The folder contained documents marked Top Secret and stamped with the seal of the Kharkiv Provincial Gendarme Administration. But what really caught his attention was the inscription in red ink on the first page. Case to be destroyed. Do not register. Alexei's hands trembled slightly as he began to read the first document. A report from a gendarme officer dated September 28, 1903. The report was addressed to the head of the Kharkiv Provincial Gendarme Administration, Colonel Fyodorov. I have the honor to report to Your Excellency on an incident of utmost importance. Today, as a result of an anonymous tip, a clandestine inspection was carried out of the basement premises in the house of the first guild merchant Bondarenko, Grigory Vasilyevich, located on Sumska Street. What was discovered in the basement defies description within the framework of ordinary events and requires a special investigation involving specialists from St. Petersburg. I request your instructions on further actions and measures to maintain the strictest secrecy. Next was a draft of Colonel Fyodorov's reply. I entrust you personally to lead the investigation. The incident has been reported to the police department. An investigative team headed by an official for special assignments, Strelnikov, is departing from the capital. Before their arrival, ensure the complete isolation of the site and absolute secrecy of all those involved in the discovery. Take those involved under special surveillance. Alexei turned the page and saw a photograph. Although it had yellowed with age, the image was quite clear. It depicted the facade of a large, two-story Art Nouveau mansion with exquisite architectural details and a wide, formal entrance. Underneath the photograph was the caption, The House of G.V. Bondarenko, Sumska Street, 1903. The next document made Alexei's blood run cold. It was a record of the initial inspection of the basement premises, compiled by a gendarme officer and signed by two witnesses, the janitor of a neighboring house and a city policeman. The document was written in dry, official language, but even through this bureaucratic form, something terrible emerged. The basement consists of 3 rooms connected by a corridor. The first room is equipped as a laboratory. It contains chemical apparatus, flasks, retorts, and books in different languages. The second room is adapted as an operating room. a table with straps, surgical instruments, and glass containers with preserving solutions. In the third room, the most remote from the entrance, a hiding place was discovered under the floor in which, here, the text broke off, and several lines had been carefully crossed out with ink so thickly that it was impossible to read them. The document continued below. According to the preliminary conclusion of police physician Samov, the items and substances discovered are related to conducting experiments of an unknown nature. To accurately determine their nature, an examination by specialists from the Imperial Medical Surgical Academy is required. Alexei put down the document, feeling a chill run down his spine. What had they discovered in the basement of the Bondarenko house? What required the intervention of experts from the capital and such secrecy? He continued to study the contents of the folder. Next was a report on the Bondarenko family, compiled for the Gendarme administration. Grigory Vasilyevich Bondarenko, 52 years old, came from prosperous peasants in the Poltava province. Starting with a small shop, he managed to develop a trading business and, by the beginning of the 20th century, owned several stores in Kharkiv, as well as shares in a sugar and leather factory. He was married to Elizaveta Karlovna, née Schultz, 45 years old, the daughter of a Russified German engineer. The couple had 3 children: a son, Nikolai, 22 years old, a student at Kharkiv University, and 2 daughters, Maria, 18 years old, and Sophia, 15 years old. Of particular interest was the postscript at the end of the report. According to informants, G.V. Bondarenko maintains close ties with foreigners, mainly from the German Empire. He often travels abroad officially on commercial matters. Among his acquaintances, individuals interested in occult sciences and spiritualism have been noted. Next in the folder were several sheets with the testimony of the Bondarenko household staff. Alexei began reading the testimony of the cook, Agrafena Ivanovna, a woman of 58 years old who had worked in the Bondarenko house for more than 10 years. The master is a strict but fair man. He pays well, doesn't mistreat us. Only in the last year or two I've started to notice strange things about him. He often locks himself in his study with various foreign gentlemen, and what they talk about, I don't understand their language. And he started going to the basement often, forbade anyone from going down there, even the janitor, to check the stoves. He said that he kept valuable wines there and a laboratory for some experiments. But he didn't say what kind of experiments. It was especially strange that sometimes at night, sounds came from there, like the screeching of metal or some kind of knocking. Once, late last year, I went down to the kitchen to get a drink of water and heard what sounded like a human moan coming from the basement. I crossed myself then and quickly went back to my room. And in the morning, I met the master. He was pale, his eyes were red, as if he hadn't slept all night, and he had a strange smell coming from him, like from a hospital. And I also noticed that the mistress, our Elizaveta Karlovna, had changed a lot lately. She used to be cheerful, walked with the children, visited people, but now she mostly sits in her room, silent, and when she thinks no one is watching her, she cries. And it's strange, she became afraid of the basement. When the master called her there once, she turned so pale that I thought she would faint. And then I heard her say to him, "Stop it, Grisha. Fear God. It won't lead to any good." But she didn't say what to stop. And one more thing. Cats started disappearing in the house. First, our kitchen cat, Muska, disappeared, then the neighbors, which often ran into our place. And when I told the master about it, he smirked strangely and replied, "Don't worry, Agrafena. They served an important purpose." I don't know what he meant, but after those words, I felt uneasy. The testimony of the maid, Daria, a girl of 20 years old, added new alarming details. I've been serving in the Bondarenko house for the 2nd year. The work is easy. The masters are cultured, treat me well, but there's something uneasy in the house. The master often brings different strange objects, books with drawings that give me goosebumps. Once, I was cleaning in his study and saw an open book on the table with drawings of human insides and some symbols around the edges. I was so scared then that I almost dropped the samovar with tea. And another thing, The master often locks himself in the basement, sometimes for the whole night, and sounds come from there, sometimes like metal banging against metal, sometimes some kind of hissing. And once I heard a strange sound, like a child crying. I asked Nikolai Grigorievich, the master's son, if he had heard anything, and he turned pale and told me to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to work here. The most terrible thing happened a month ago. Little Liza, the daughter of the laundress from the neighboring house, disappeared. They searched for her for 3 days, turned the whole city upside down, and on the 4th day, they found her dead near the river. They said she had drowned, but it was strange that when they buried her, her mother cried that there were some marks on the girl's body, like pricks. And at the same time, I noticed that the master became even more nervous, often locked himself in his study, and drank a lot, which he hadn't done before. And recently, I accidentally overheard a conversation between the master and mistress. Elizaveta Karlovna was crying and saying, "You've crossed the line, Grigory. This is no longer science. This is a mortal sin." And he replied to her, "You don't understand, Liza. I'm almost at the goal. A little more and we can bring back our Mashenka." Who is Mashenka? I don't know. There's no such person in their family. Alexei tore himself away from reading, feeling a chill run down his spine. Who was Mashenka that Bondarenko was talking about, and what experiments was he conducting in his basement? The next document in the folder was a letter from St. Petersburg from the director of the police department addressed to the head of the Kharkiv Provincial Gendarme Administration. In connection with the extraordinary nature of the case concerning the items and substances discovered in the house of merchant Bondarenko, I prescribe, first, strengthen the security of the house and ensure the complete isolation of the basement premises. Second, until the arrival of a special investigative team from St. Petersburg, do not take any action to seize the discovered items and documents. Third, establish covert surveillance of all members of the Bondarenko family and their immediate circle. Fourth, prepare a secret room for conducting interrogations and investigative actions, excluding the possibility of information leakage. Fifth, all police and gendarmerie ranks involved in the case must sign a statement of personal responsibility for disclosing information. The case has been taken under the special control of His Imperial Majesty. This document indicated the exceptional importance and secrecy of the investigation. Alexei continued to look through the papers and came across several photographs. The first two depicted the basement of the Bondarenko house, a laboratory with numerous flasks, retorts, and strange devices connected to electric batteries, and a room equipped as an operating room with a metal table in the middle on which straps for fixation were visible. But the third photograph made Alexei gasp in horror. It depicted a hiding place discovered under the floor of the third room in the basement. In it were several glass containers with a murky liquid in which floated. Alexei couldn't believe his eyes. The containers held parts of human bodies, hands, feet, and even what looked like a child's head. Next to the containers lay neatly arranged surgical instruments and some manuscripts. Barely suppressing nausea, Alexei put down the photographs and took the next document. A report from a medical expert, Professor Valentin Nikolaevich Schwartz of the Imperial Medical Surgical Academy, who arrived from St. Petersburg. Based on the examination of the items and substances discovered in the basement of the Bondarenko house, I can draw the following conclusions. The human body parts found in the glass containers have undergone special preservation using a solution containing formalin and other chemical substances, presumably of an experimental nature. Judging by the condition of the tissues, the operations to separate these body parts were performed on living people, as evidenced by characteristic traces of hemorrhages and vascular spasms. Of particular interest are the traces of injections of an unknown substance found on all samples. Chemical analysis revealed the presence of compounds unknown to modern science, including organic and metallic components. In my opinion, these substances were intended for some kind of experiment to preserve the viability of separated body parts. Among the documents found in the hiding place, manuscripts in German and Latin deserve special attention, containing descriptions of experiments to revive dead tissue by means of electrical stimulation and the introduction of special solutions. The author of the manuscripts, presumably Bondarenko himself, refers to the works of Dr. Johann Conrad Diepel and a certain Professor Waldman from Vienna, whose research is officially recognized by science as heretical and contrary to both scientific ethics and Christian morality. The manuscripts also contain numerous sketches of devices for transferring life energy from one being to another, as well as records of observations of the results of experiments on animals and, most alarmingly, on humans. Judging by these records, Bondarenko was trying to carry out what he called the resurrection of a deceased child, presumably his son, by transferring life energy from other children. I consider it necessary to classify Bondarenko's actions as scientific obscurantism bordering on ritual murders and recommend that the case be transferred to the jurisdiction of a special department of the police department for investigation under conditions of the strictest secrecy. Attached to Professor Schwartz's report was a short note from the official for special assignments, Strelnikov. The case is taking a political turn. According to available information, Bondarenko was associated with the secret Thule Society in Germany, whose members are engaged in the study of occult sciences and eugenic experiments. I suspect that his research may have been funded by foreign sources. I request sanctions for the arrest of all members of the Bondarenko family and a thorough search of their estate in the Poltava province. Next followed the interrogation record of Grigory Vasilyevich Bondarenko himself, conducted on October 3, 1903. Bondarenko, apparently, did not deny his involvement with the items found in the basement, but gave them a completely different explanation. I did conduct scientific experiments in the laboratory equipped in the basement of my house, but the purpose of these experiments was noble and corresponded to the latest achievements of science. I was trying to find a way to prolong the life of human tissues outside the body, which could save many lives in the future, including the lives of wounded soldiers of our empire. As for the discovered body parts, I acquired them from Dr. Meyer of the University of Berlin for scientific purposes. They all belonged to deceased people and were legally obtained for research. I deny any involvement in the disappearance of children in Kharkiv and consider these accusations slander aimed at discrediting my name and my scientific research. My connections with German scientists are explained solely by scientific interests. Yes, I corresponded with some members of the Thule Society, but exclusively on matters of theoretical physics and chemistry. I pursued no political or other reprehensible goals. As for the Mashenka mentioned in my notes, I am referring to my youngest son, Mikhail, who died of scarlet fever at the age of 4 in 1896. His death was a terrible blow to me and my wife, from which she never recovered. I admit that in my grief, I became carried away by ideas about the possibility of bringing the dead back to life, but this was only a theoretical fascination that had no practical implementation. However, the next document, the medical examination report of the remains found in the basement, completely refuted these claims. According to the results of the forensic medical examination, it has been established that the human body parts found in the glass containers belong to at least 7 different individuals, among whom 3 children aged 4 to 9 years and 4 adults have been identified. Time of death of all victims: no more than 6 months before the moment of discovery. Traces of lifetime surgical interventions performed without proper anesthesia have been found on all the examined samples, as evidenced by characteristic changes in the tissues. Also, there are traces of injections of an unknown bluish substance on all samples, which was injected directly into the blood vessels. Of particular interest is the child's head found in one of the containers. According to experts, it belonged to a boy of 6 to 7 years old who died about 2 months ago. There are traces of trepanation of the skull and the insertion of electrodes into the brain tissue. In addition, traces of connection to some kind of apparatus are visible in the neck area, presumably for supplying blood or other liquid. Based on the totality of evidence, it can be confidently asserted that all the victims were subjected to violent acts incompatible with life. Moreover, these actions were of a scientific nature. The presumed goal of these experiments is to study the possibility of preserving the viability of separated body parts and their subsequent connection. This conclusion finally refuted Bondarenko's version of the legal origin of the human remains. Alexei could hardly believe that such horrors had taken place in the center of Kharkiv at the beginning of the 20th century. The next few documents were devoted to search operations to establish the identities of the victims. The police managed to identify 3. They were Stepan, a homeless beggar who disappeared in July 1903, Margarita from a brothel on the outskirts of the city who disappeared in May, and Petya, 7 years old, the son of a laundress who worked in the block next to Bondarenko's house who disappeared in August. The remaining victims could not be identified. Further investigation revealed other accomplices in the crimes. The interrogation record of the Bondarenko house's janitor, Fedot Kuzmich, 47 years old, contained the following testimony. Yes, I knew that the master was conducting some experiments in the basement, but I wasn't interested in what exactly. It's not my business, good sirs. The master paid well, sometimes gave special assignments, to bring some vagrants or prostitutes to the back door, supposedly for work. I did it, took the money, and what happened to them later is not my business. But about the children, that's not true. I never brought children to the master, I swear to God. Except maybe once in August, I brought a little boy, the son of the laundress. But the master said he wanted to hire him as a servant, and the boy was an orphan, his mother raised him alone, they were poor. I thought it would be better for him to serve the master than to run around the streets. And what happened to him later, I don't know. In the testimony of Bondarenko's son, Nikolai, new terrible details were revealed. Yes, I knew about my father's experiments. Moreover, I helped him in some of them, but not of my own free will. Father forced me, threatened to disinherit me and kick me out of the house. And when I once refused to help him, he showed me Misha, Mikhail, my younger brother, who died of scarlet fever 7 years ago. But, Father, he had preserved his body all these years. It was in a special solution in the furthest room of the basement, in a glass sarcophagus. The body didn't decompose. It looked as if Misha was just sleeping. Father said that he had found a way to preserve dead tissues from decomposition, and that this was only the first step. The second step, he said, was much more difficult, to bring those tissues back to life. For this, he needed life energy, which he was trying to extract from other people. At first, he experimented on animals, but the results did not satisfy him. Then he began to use vagrants and prostitutes whom no one would look for. And when even that wasn't enough, he turned his attention to children. I didn't know what he was doing with these people, I swear. I thought he was just taking blood from them or performing some painless procedures. Only later, when I accidentally went down to the basement at night and saw what was happening there, I realized the full horror of his experiments. But by that time, I was already an accomplice, and my father made it clear to me that if I told anyone, I would go to penal servitude with him. Mother knew about Misha, but not about the other victims. Father convinced her that everything he was doing was for the sake of bringing our brother back. She believed him or wanted to believe him. In recent months, she had hardly left her room and was taking large doses of laudanum to cope with the nightmares. As for my sisters, the youngest, Sophia, knew nothing. And Maria once saw my father lead some ragged man into the basement. The next day, she asked me, "Where did that man go?" I lied to her, saying that my father had hired him for some work and sent him to our estate. But she, it seems, didn't believe me. Since then, she has become very withdrawn and often cried at night. Nikolai Bondarenko concluded his testimony with an admission that shed light on the final stage of his father's experiments. A week before everything was revealed, my father told me that he was close to completing his great work. He had created some kind of apparatus that, according to him, could direct life energy from a donor to a recipient. The donor was to be a healthy child, and the recipient was Misha's body. I begged him to abandon this insane idea, but he was obsessed. He said that he had already conducted successful experiments with individual body parts, that he had been able to revive the hand of one of the victims and make it move independently for several hours. That night, when the police came, he was just preparing for the final experiment. He had a boy in his basement, the son of the laundress. Father tied him to the table and connected him to the apparatus. The other end of the apparatus was connected to Misha's body. I don't know exactly what happened next, because I couldn't stand it and went upstairs. But a few minutes later, such a scream came from the basement. I had never heard anything like it in my life. It was not a child's cry and not my father's cry. It was something inhuman. When I went back down, my father was standing over Misha's body, which was moving, but these were unusual movements. The body was arching at unnatural angles, and the eyes opened, but there was nothing human in them. And the sounds that Misha was making were not a child's voice, but some kind of wheezing mixed with screeching. My father was in ecstasy. He was shouting that he had succeeded, that Misha had returned. But it wasn't Misha. What was lying on the table, twitching and making those terrible sounds, was not my brother. It was something monstrous, something that should not have existed. And the boy, the son of the laundress, he lay on the other table, motionless, with open eyes in which there was no life. But his body was strangely emaciated, as if all the liquids had been sucked out of it. I don't know what would have happened next, because at that moment the police burst into the basement. Nikolai Bondarenko's testimony ended there. The next document in the folder was a gendarme officer's report on the arrest of Grigory Bondarenko. During the arrest, the suspect offered fierce resistance, shouting that we had no right to interrupt his great experiment. It took for lower ranks to restrain him. At the same time, he continued to shout that his son had already returned and that we must not separate them again. The removal of the boy's body, which was on the table in the third room of the basement, presented particular difficulties. Despite obvious signs of the absence of life, the body continued to make convulsive movements and emit inarticulate sounds, even after being disconnected from the equipment. On the recommendation of Professor Schwartz, who arrived on the scene, the body was immediately immersed in a formalin solution to stop these phenomena. Attached to the report was a photograph of this animated body. Alexei stared at the blurred image for a long time, trying to understand what was captured on it. The boy's body in the photograph was distorted, either by convulsions or by the process of decomposition. The partially blurred face expressed either agony or some inhuman feeling, but the most terrible thing was the eyes, wide open. They were looking directly at Alexei through time and space. Next came the conclusion of the medical commission regarding the mental state of Grigory Bondarenko. The subject shows signs of monomania due to the loss of a child. His obsession with the idea of bringing his deceased son back to life has taken pathological forms, leading to the commission of serious crimes. At the same time, the subject is fully aware of the nature of his actions, but considers them justified by a higher goal, victory over death. Of particular danger are his knowledge in the fields of chemistry, physiology, and electrical phenomena, which he used to conduct his experiments. The subject claims to have achieved success and managed to partially restore his son's body to life, although he admits that the result did not fully meet expectations. When asked about the fate of the other victims, the subject replies that they sacrificed themselves for the sake of science, and that their death was necessary for a great breakthrough in understanding the mysteries of life and death. The Commission believes that Grigory Bondarenko poses an exceptional danger to society and recommends his permanent detention in a closed ward of a psychiatric hospital with a special supervision regime. The next document was the most unexpected. It was a letter from the director of the police department to the head of the Kharkov Provincial Gendarme Directorate, dated October 15, 1903. In connection with the special nature of the Bondarenko the merchant's case, and in agreement with higher authorities, I order the following. First, all investigative materials in the Bondarenko case are to be removed from the General Registry and transferred to a special department of the police department. Second, all persons involved in the investigation are to be notified, with acknowledgement of receipt, of the prohibition against disclosing any information about the case, under threat of criminal prosecution. Third, Grigory Bondarenko is to be transferred to a closed psychiatric hospital of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in St. Petersburg for further examination. Fourth, Bondarenko's scientific records and equipment are to be transferred for study to a special laboratory at the Medico-Surgical Academy. Fifth, Bondarenko's house is to be sealed, and the basement sealed up. The question of demolishing the building under the pretext of street widening is to be decided later. Sixth, official reports for the press are to state that the merchant Bondarenko is accused of financial fraud and has fled abroad to evade investigation. Report on the execution of this order immediately. A short handwritten note, signed L.A., was attached to the letter. The materials on the experiment may be of interest to our special research. Ensure their preservation and delivery. Alexei wondered what this note meant, who L.A. and SV were, and what kind of special research could have interested high-ranking officials of Tsarist Russia. The next few pages in the folder were devoted to the fate of the Bondarenko family members. Elizaveta Karlovna, Grigory Vasilyevic's wife, committed suicide shortly after her husband's arrest by taking a large dose of laudanum. In her suicide note, she wrote only one phrase, "Forgive me, Mashenka, I couldn't stop him." Nikolai Bondarenko was arrested as an accomplice, but then, after several months of investigation, he was unexpectedly released for lack of evidence. He immediately left the country, presumably for Germany, and his trail was lost. The elder daughter, Maria, was placed in a closed boarding school for girls of noble origin in Moscow, and the younger daughter, Sofia, was sent to her mother's relatives in Riga. Next came a strange document, a medical certificate of death for Grigory Bondarenko, dated December 3, 1903. Patient Bondarenko GV, who was being held in a closed ward of the psychiatric hospital of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, died of cardiac arrest. Death occurred at 23:15. Immediately before his death, the patient was in a state of extreme agitation, shouting that he has come and that Mashenka has found him. The on-duty doctor, Sokolov KP, and the orderly Petrov AI, who entered the ward in response to the screams, found the patient dead. Upon examination of the body, strange marks were found on the neck and chest, resembling the fingerprints of a child. However, there were no other persons in the ward, and the door was locked from the outside. A short note from the director of the hospital was attached to the certificate. Please consider the patient Bondarenko's death as natural. The mention of strange marks on the body should be excluded from the official conclusion. The last document in the folder was a report on the demolition of the Bondarenko house, dated May 1904. The house of the former merchant Bondarenko on Sumskaya Street has been demolished in accordance with the city council's decision to widen the street. The basement, which had been previously walled up, was backfilled with earth and gravel. A small park will be laid out on the site of the house. Note: during the demolition of the building, 3 workers reported hearing strange sounds coming from behind the walled-up basement wall. By order of Bailiff Sokolovsky, these statements were dismissed as the result of excessive alcohol consumption, and the workers were suspended from work. That was the end of the folder's contents. Alexei sat there stunned by what he had read. The story of the Bondarenko family, their terrifying basement, and Grigory Vasilyevic's insane experiments seemed incredible, like the plot of a Gothic novel. And yet, the documents, the photographs, the official reports, it was all quite real. He carefully put the documents back into the folder, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it in the metal box. Then, after thinking for a few minutes, he decided to return the box to its hiding place. Something told him that this story should not become public knowledge, at least not yet. Leaving the archives, Alexei decided to stroll along Sumskaya Street to see with his own eyes the place where the Bondarenko house once stood. It was one of the central streets of Kharkov, wide and busy. Alexei walked along, looking at the old buildings, many of which had been preserved from pre-revolutionary times. And suddenly he stopped at the place where, according to his calculations, the Bondarenko house should have been located. Now there was indeed a small park with a fountain in the middle. Children were playing around the fountain. Mothers and grandmothers were sitting on benches. Elderly men were playing chess at stone tables. Alexei walked over to a sign posted at the entrance to the park. It read, Pushkin AES Park, established in 1904. Everything matched up. This was the very place. He slowly walked along the paths of the park, trying to imagine what the Bondarenko house looked like. Where exactly was the entrance to the basement that had become the site of such terrible events? And suddenly his attention was drawn to a strange feature of the fountain. The water in it had a slight reddish tint. Alexei went closer and saw that the bottom of the fountain was lined with reddish stone, which gave the water this color. But still, there was something unsettling about it. An elderly woman was sitting near the fountain, feeding pigeons. Alexei sat down next to her and cautiously started a conversation. Excuse me, do you know why the water in the fountain is so reddish? The woman looked at him in surprise. Are you not from around here? Everyone in Kharkov knows that this fountain is called the Bloody Fountain. They say that when it was being built, one of the workers fell into the pit and crashed to his death. Since then, no matter how much they clean the fountain, the water always has a red tinge. Of course, it's all just stories. It's just the stone. Have you heard what was on this site before the park? Asked Alexei. The woman pondered. My grandmother used to tell me that there was a large house here, belonging to some rich merchant, but then it was demolished to widen the street. And she also said that the house was haunted, that at night you could hear a child crying from the basement. But of course, that's all just make-believe. Grandma loved scary stories. Alexei thanked the woman and walked on. At the exit of the park, he saw a little boy who was standing alone and looking at the fountain. The boy was dressed strangely in a suit of old cut, the kind that children wore in the early 20th century. Alexei became curious and approached the child. "Hello, are you waiting for someone?" he asked. The boy slowly turned to him. His face was pale, his eyes unnaturally bright. "I'm waiting for my dad," he replied in a quiet voice. "He promised he'd bring me back to life." A shiver ran down Alexei's spine. He blinked, and the boy disappeared, as if he had never been there. Alexei looked around. None of the passers-by seemed to have noticed anything unusual. He quickly left the park and headed home, trying to convince himself that it was just a figment of his imagination, triggered by the documents he had read. But deep down, he knew that he had seen Mashenka Bondarenko, the boy whose death had led to such terrible events. Back home, Alexei couldn't sleep for a long time. He thought about the documents he had read, about the Bondarenko house, about the terrible experiments in the basement, and, most importantly, about Mashenka. What if Grigory Bondarenko's insane experiment had had some results after all? What if he had really managed to partially bring his son back to life, even in such a terrible form? And what if that restless soul was still wandering around the place where their house once stood? 30 years passed. Alexei Naumov became a famous historian, a professor at Kharkov University. He wrote several books on the history of the city, but never mentioned the Bondarenko case in them. This story remained his personal secret. And then one day, while conducting a seminar with students, he heard a strange question from one of them. "Professor, have you heard about the bloody basement on Sumskaya Street? They say that some merchant at the beginning of the century conducted terrible experiments on people there." Alexei froze. In 30 years, no one had asked him such a question. He looked closely at the student. An ordinary young man, nothing special. "Where did you get this information?" he asked as calmly as possible. "My grandfather worked in the regional archives," the student replied. "Before his death, he told me that he had found some secret documents about the merchant Bondarenko and his experiments on reviving the dead. But when he came the next day to study them in more detail, the documents had disappeared, and a week later, my grandfather died of a heart attack." Alexei felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't the only one who had found that folder, and perhaps not the only one who had seen the ghost of Mashenka Bondarenko. "It's just an urban legend," he replied to the student. "There are no documents in the archives confirming this story." After the class, Alexei went to the fountain in the park on Sumskaya Street. He had often come here over the years, but had never seen the strange boy again. Now the park was empty. Late autumn. A cold wind was chasing fallen leaves along the paths. The fountain had been turned off for the winter. Alexei sat down on a bench and pondered. Maybe it's worth telling the world the truth about what happened in the Bondarenko house? Or is it better for this story to remain buried, like that terrible basement? And suddenly he felt a touch on his hand, light as a breath of wind. He turned his head and saw him, Mashenka Bondarenko, standing next to the bench. The boy looked the same as he had 30 years ago. Pale face, bright, unnatural eyes, old-fashioned suit. "Don't tell," said the boy in a quiet voice. "Let Papa stay with me. We're still waiting for the experiment to be completed." Alexei blinked, and the ghost disappeared. But on his hand remained a small, barely noticeable trace, like a child's fingerprints. That day, Alexei Naumov made a decision. He would never tell about what he had found in the archives. Some secrets should remain buried. But sometimes at night, when the wind howls in the pipes, it seems to him that he hears a child crying, coming from somewhere underground. And every time he passes the park on Sumskaya Street, He involuntarily slows down, looking out among the playing children for the pale boy in the old-fashioned suit. And the water in the fountain still reflects red. And they say that sometimes at night, when the city falls asleep, you can see a strange figure of a man in the park who wanders around the fountain as if looking for something. And if you listen closely, you can hear him calling out, "Mishenka, where are you? Papa has come back for you." In the 2000s, when the park was being reconstructed, workers discovered a strange structure underground, the remains of an old basement with a walled-up door. When the door was opened, behind it was an empty room with a stone table in the center. On the table lay decayed straps and some metal objects, the purpose of which no one could determine. And on the wall, in chalk, was written one phrase, "I'm still waiting for you, Mishenka." Officially, the authorities explained the find as the remains of an old technical building from the early 20th century. The room was walled up again, and the fountain was restored to its former location. And no one paid attention to the strange coincidence. Immediately after the completion of the work, a 7-year-old boy disappeared in the city. He was never found, and the day after the disappearance, the water in the restored fountain, for the first time in many years, lost its reddish tint. Now it was crystal clear, but it didn't last long. A week later, the water turned reddish again. And since then, they say that if you come to the fountain at midnight and say the name Mishenka 3 times, you can see the reflection of a pale boy in the water. And if you listen closely, you can hear him whisper softly, "Help me. I want to come back to life." But maybe it's just another urban legend? Or is it?